In our next topic, we're going to be talking about nutrition, focusing on the human digestive system. And so we know that because humans are heterotrophs, we have to consume other organisms in order to obtain energy. And when that happens, when we do consume foods, they're typically in a complex, large molecules. They're carbohydrates and fats and proteins. And these large molecules, as we learned in our last unit, they can't move through cell membranes very easily. And so typically the digestive system's role is to take these large complex molecules and break them down, or we would say digest them. Break them into smaller molecules that can actually be absorbed into the bloodstream and distributed throughout the body. And so human digestion consists of basically a long tube from the mouth all the way throughout the body into various organs, and then eventually leaving the body at the rectum. And when we consume food, if we swallow, a piece of a cereal bar, it doesn't just fall into our stomach by gravity. It's actually squeezed from the esophagus down into the stomach, and it'll continue to be squeezed throughout the entire digestive system. That process is called peristalsis. It basically works like if you're squeezing the toothpaste out of a toothpaste tube. You start at one end and you squeeze closer and closer to the opening, and you're squeezing all the paste through there. That's similar to how our digestive system works. Muscles contract one after the other, squeezing the food through the digestive tract. We also know that process can happen in reverse, and that's what happens when you vomit. Is peristalsis happens in reverse, bringing food out of the mouth. In this diagram, we can see sort of the overall details of the digestive system, various organs, and we'll be talking about a bunch of these different organs as we move through our notes here. So we'll start with the mouth, or also called the oral cavity. So our mouth's function is to ingest food. And actually digestion begins here in the mouth. When we chew our food, we're breaking large chunks of food into smaller pieces. That process is called mechanical digestion. We're mechanically breaking up our food into smaller pieces. And this has a purpose. Breaking our food into smaller pieces increases the surface area on which enzymes can start to act. And the greater the surface area, the more easily those foods are going to be digested. Also in our mouth, we have some digestive enzymes. Our saliva contains enzymes which are adapted to take polysaccharides, large carbohydrate molecules, and break them into smaller, simpler monosaccharides and disaccharides. That process begins in our saliva. If you were to take a cracker, for example, put it in your mouth and chew it up for a long time, keep it in your mouth, allow your saliva to work on it, you're going to notice that the cracker changes from sort of a starchy taste to a sweeter taste over time. And that's because these enzymes in our saliva are taking the starch molecules and they're breaking them down over time. Those enzymes are called salivary amylase. When we swallow our food, it then moves into a tube that's called the esophagus. And this esophagus is basically just a transportation. It's just a means of getting the food from the mouth down into the stomach. It's about 10 inches long. It uses that process we just talked about, peristalsis, to squeeze the food from our mouth down into our stomach. Once the food reaches the stomach is a hollow, muscular sort of pouch that is going to hold the food for a period of time from 2 to 6 hours maybe. And in our stomach, we have a mix of enzymes and acids which really get the chemical digestion process accelerating. Much of the digestion of proteins takes place in the stomach. And so there's hydrochloric acid in our stomach. There are enzymes, gastric protease, which breaks down proteins. And so these enzymes start working on this food and basically change it from the solid chunks that we swallowed into a liquidy, sort of partially digested liquid called chyme. And the acidity of the stomach is pretty high. It has a very low pH. Remember, a low pH indicates high acidity. It's between 1.5 to 2.5. And you might think that hydrochloric acid would be damaging, but the stomach lining has a layer of mucus inside of it that are produced by special glands, and they help to protect that stomach muscle and the lining itself from the strong acid. There are times when that acid starts to break down. If it breaks down that lining, then it forms what's called an ulcer. An ulcer is damage to the lining of the stomach due to these acidic conditions. These gastric juices, are what we call them, are breaking down the food. The acidity is helping to break down the food. And at the ends of the stomach, in the top and the bottom, are these muscles that can open and close. They're called sphincter muscles. And they control when food enters the stomach and also when it leaves. So the sphincter, called the cardiac sphincter, is the one at the top, the esophagus. It keeps the food in our stomach. And the pyloric sphincter is the one at the bottom that keeps the food from leaving the stomach until it's ready. When it is ready to move on, this pyloric sphincter opens up, and that chyme from the stomach can move on into the small intestine. Here we have some pictures that show some of the things we just talked about. So we can see in the mouth the salivary glands that are spread around our mouth. They squirt saliva into our mouth when we're eating to start the digestion process. You may have noticed this if you ever have yawned while you're looking at your phone or reading a book. You might see a little spray of saliva because you happen to open your mouth wide just as these salivary glands were spraying saliva, and so you get that little spray there. We could see an overview. We could see the mouth and the esophagus. We could see it leads to the stomach. We can see the two sphincter muscles, the cardiac sphincter at the top to keep food in the stomach, and then the pyloric sphincter at the bottom, which prevents the food from leaving the stomach until it's ready. We also can see over here sort of the lining of the stomach is a very convoluted and bent lining, and this is where the mucus is produced that helps protect our stomach lining. And we can also see the effects if there is a problem. If the stomach acid has worn away at that lining, we can have these ulcers. We can see damage to the lining of the stomach due to this process. Once the food is finished in the stomach, it then is going to make its way into the small intestine. The small intestine, it's called the small intestine because it's of a narrower diameter. But it's actually really long. It's about 20 feet long. And as the food is moving through this very long tube, it's moving through this peristalsis. Along the way, enzymes are being secreted that are going to help to digest that food even further. Some of those enzymes include proteases, which digest proteins. Lipases help digest fats. Disaccharidases digest the disaccharides. And so these different enzymes are helping to break down these more complex molecules into the simpler compounds. There's also compounds such as bile are produced. Bile is a substance that's made in our liver, and it helps to break down fat, helps to emulsify fat molecules. And this bile is produced in the liver, and then it's sent off to a special organ called the gallbladder where it's stored. And then the gallbladder releases the bile into the small intestine through this thing called the bile duct whenever it's necessary. And this bile is also basic. It helps to neutralize some of the acids that were coming into the small intestine from the stomach, and that's important as well. Because these enzymes in the small intestine, they work best at a pH that's much more neutral. And so this bile and the pancreatic juices help to neutralize the acids. The pancreatic juices are more digestive enzymes produced in the pancreas. They go through a duct tube called the pancreatic duct, get excreted into the small intestine. I should say secreted in the small intestine. And again, these materials, these pancreatic juices, are neutralizing the acid. They also are producing hormones that can help break down those materials. So the pH of the material once it gets in the intestine is about 7.3 to 8.2, much more neutral than the material that was in the stomach. As the food is being broken down and moving through the small intestine, the lining of the small intestine is not a smooth tube. It's made of all of these bumps and ridges. They kind of look like fingers projecting from the lining. Those are called villi. And villi are really important because what they do is they increase the surface area of the small intestine. Okay? Because this is where the nutrients from the foods that we eat are going to be absorbed into our blood. And we could see sort of a cross section here. So this is the lining of the small intestine. This is one of those villi. And what you could see is that in the villi are blood vessels, capillaries. So that as food's passing over these villi, nutrients that have been broken down, glucose and amino acids and so forth, they can be absorbed through the lining of the small intestine into the blood, where they can then be distributed throughout the body. And so those nutrients that are absorbed in the blood from the small intestine goes to the liver first, and that helps to process some of those materials, detoxify certain materials, and then they can be distributed through the body. After food has made its way through this 20-foot long tube called the small intestine, it moves into sort of the last part of the digestive system, which is the large intestine. The large intestine is called that because it's wider than the small intestine, but it's much shorter. It's only about 4 feet long. And the function of the large intestine is to reabsorb water from that chyme that's moving through the digestive system. By the time the food reaches the large intestine, digestion is already finished. Everything is completely broken down into the simplest components. And when the food reaches the large intestine, most of the valuable materials have been absorbed already into the blood. What's left is non-digested material and water. And so as this material moves through this large intestine, the excess water is reabsorbed so it can be maintained in the body. And so the parts of the large intestine, this is the small intestine. There's the ascending colon, which goes up the person's right side of their body, across their body, and down the descending colon until it leaves the body at the rectum. And if the large intestine is not absorbing enough water and there's too much water in with that undigested material, then that's what leads to diarrhea, that there's excess water in this undigested material. If too much water is removed, that can lead to constipation. And so those digestive issues are issues that happen due to the large intestine. Also in the large intestine and throughout the digestive system are specialized bacteria, helpful bacteria called E. coli, different versions of E. coli. These bacteria help in digesting material that otherwise we wouldn't be able to digest. They release things like vitamin K. And so these are helpful bacteria. They're called gut bacteria, gut microbiota. If you've ever heard of probiotics, those are drinks or foods that may have in them living bacteria that are helpful to our digestive system. Sometimes if a person is taking antibiotics, they actually, the antibiotics, besides killing the bacteria in their infection, they could also kill the bacteria that are in their digestive system. And that can lead to things like stomach pain or diarrhea because we've destroyed some of the helpful bacteria that are in our digestive system. Sometimes you can repopulate your digestive system with bacteria from these probiotics. By the time material through the digestive system reaches the descending colon, basically up, the water's been reabsorbed, And all that's left really is material that's undigestible, some bacteria and mucus, some cells from the digestive system, and that's what we call feces. Feces is the undigested material from what we ate. And then that feces needs to be eliminated from the colon periodically through the anus. There's also an organ that's part of the large intestine called the appendix. And we can see the appendix here. It's just sort of a little projection, kind of a little tail that's right near where the small intestine leads to the large intestine. And sometimes this can get infected. When I was 12 years old, my appendix got infected. And bacteria can get into it and cause an infection, cause it to swell up. And in those cases, you might have to have your appendix removed. I had mine removed when I was 12. Because if the appendix ruptured, if it broke, the bacteria causing infection would spill inside of the abdominal cavity and can really cause serious problems. So it needs to be taken care of. And the appendix, sometimes you'll say, well, it has no function, but actually scientists do believe that the purpose of the appendix is it can hold on to sort of some gut microbes, some bacteria that can be used to repopulate the rest of the digestive tract if the bacteria die. So it's not that it doesn't have any function, but you certainly can live just fine without it. I've never had any digestive problems, and I haven't had an appendix in 35 years or so. I'll post these videos on Google Classroom so you can see them. This follows it's a camera going through the digestive system, so you can kind of see what it looks like. And again, here what we see are some of these microbes that might be in our digestive tract. We can see beneficial bacteria like E. coli, lactobacilli, bifidobacteria. These help us with digestion. They're important. But there are other bacteria that if they get into our digestive system or if they become dominant, they can cause some problems such as diarrhea and so forth. C. difficile is one that's commonly affects people, you may have heard of. So we're going to stop there. I will also post this video for you to watch in your notes.